congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
Heard the happy news.
Yeah, Florian's actually walking with our baby right now whilst he listens to your talk, so he's multitasking.
That's it's a privilege to have an extra audience member.
I hope he doesn't hear anything.
I'll try to talk really. I'm not trying to make it really boring, so he stays asleep.
No, not possible.
Okay. Hello, Catherine. Thank you so much for organizing everything.
No problem. You're welcome. We are very happy to have you here.
Chris, what is the vaccination situation now at UK?
Yeah, we're doing all right. So they just this week opened vaccines to the under 30s. So in the UK, it's been extraordinarily strictly ordered by people's age. Well, age and vulnerability, but particularly age. So yeah, so under 30s are now being vaccinated. So there's two things going on at the moment. So one is that yeah, there's a fairly extensive vaccination program. The other is that there is this new variant, which people are calling Delta, which is spreading very fast. So we've had, case numbers in the UK have, I think, doubled in the last week, but they doubled from a very low base rate.
So it takes time to start in-person working.
Well, so there's a big debate in the country at the moment because the government had earmarked the 21st of June as being a date at which restrictions would be definitively lifted. But they had said that was obviously subject to the context. And so there's a big question mark over whether the vaccination program has progressed far enough to allow that to happen. But yeah, it's a bit hairy. But I understand that in Germany, obviously there was a wave earlier or in the spring, but now things are more settled. Is that broadly correct?
I heard that in-person working would start at September, but perhaps earlier. I'm not sure.
Well, fingers crossed. Yeah, I think we're hoping the students will come back in September. I mean, I think the students are hoping the students will come back in September for sure. For us, it doesn't matter so much.
Are we supposed to record this session or no?
Yes, I'm recording.
Are you recording? Okay.
Thank you.
So if you could avoid broadcasting my amateur estimate of the vaccine situation in the UK on YouTube, that would probably be for the best. My expertise definitely, I don't know how far it extends to neuroscience, but it certainly doesn't extend to the political medical situation.
Perhaps I should start. It is 3 o'clock at 2 p.m. and we are going to start. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second session in the new season of MOCO seminars. It is my honor to introduce Professor Chris Summerfield. He trained in psychology and neuroscience in London, Barcelona, New York, and Paris. He has been faculty in Oxford Department of Experimental Psychology since 2008. His work focuses on learning and decision-making in humans. He's also a research scientist at DeepMind. Chris, welcome to MPI. We are looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for the kind invitation. Thank you everyone for coming. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak to you also, so many people in Tübingen whose work I know and admire very much. So I've prepared a talk which is a little bit different. So there's a few talks up on our lab website, which I've given, or myself and lab members have given over the past year, which summarize some of our recent work. But to avoid repeating myself, I've written a new talk, which is probably deliberately a little bit disjointed, because it's, rather than being organized around a single line of research, it's organized around a big picture theme. And I draw upon some different ideas to try to illustrate that theme. So I hope it works, and I hope you enjoy it. So it's called Knowledge Partitioning in Humans and Neural Networks. And yeah, so just before I begin, I'm blessed with a really amazing lab, and the work that I'm going to talk about today was especially done, the first part by Timo Flesch, second part by Steph Nelly, and the final part by Ron Decker, with a lot of collaboration along the way, in particular from Andrew Sachs, who's our PI in Oxford now as well. Okay, so I think, sometimes, certainly during the pandemic, it's felt to me a lot that that life is a lot like this, right? So we're faced with a lot of information, and the challenge, of course, is to organize it and fit it together in a way which is suitable for action selection. And I think that probably in neuroscience today, and in machine learning as well, we tell a story about how the brain does that looks a little bit like this, right? So what happens is that there are various either perceptual or conceptual features of the information that we experience. And part of information processing is really to kind of sort those into coherent groups, right? And those groups might pertain to things like simple basic features like color and shape. They might be objects or individuals like these people or these fruit, or they might pertain to kind of like high level organizational themes, like all the Lego parts on the right come from the Lego Star Wars theme. And, I think that increasingly today in neuroscience, as well as in machine learning, there's a great deal of interest in how we solve the problem of dealing with novelty, and in particular, how we make inferences about novel, unseen information, particularly in situations which are, kind of really, really different from those that we've experienced already. And I think that the field, or the fields, are converging upon a story, which I guess it's an old story, but the story is that, by forming abstractions, which are essentially invariances over these perceptual, conceptual, or semantic features, we can essentially, that allows us to process new unseen information in ways that go beyond our existing our existing experiences. So, if I see a new Lego Star Wars piece, then I can kind of abstract over, using my knowledge of Star Wars, I can abstract over its features, and I can, deal with it appropriately. And so, obviously, there's a great deal of interest in this right now, and in how we might, how computationally we might solve the problem of forming these high-level abstractions. And of course, the real challenge with forming abstractions that are over, not just over perceptual features, but over semantic or conceptual features, is that you can't just do function approximation on your inputs, right? So in other words, you can't just use the intrinsic smoothness of the world, the fact that features might vary smoothly, and you can do interpolation. You can't just use those features to solve the problem. And so the abstractions need to be grounded somewhere else, right? And I think that's the real challenge. And I think in machine learning at the moment, there's a hope that grounding problem will go away if your model is expressive enough and your data is big enough. And I think that's a kind of recurring theme that we see right now in lots of discussions around, if you take, the views of people like Richard Sutton, for example, that, you really just need to build big models and you'll solve this problem of abstraction. So in the talk today, I'm going to present a different view. Sorry. So yeah, so supporting that the view that we really just need to build big models, and when we build big models, they'll form potent abstractions. We have evidence from two big models. So one big model in biology and one big model shown here from machine learning. So the three plots on the right show essentially the results of a kind of neuroscience experiment, almost like a kind of single cell recording experiment. It's actually a sort of activation maximization experiment done on a machine learning architecture called CLIP. CLIP is the multimodal version of, or one of the multimodal versions of GPT-3, which is the very, very large language model released by OpenAI some 12 to 18 months ago now. And what they've done is they've essentially tried they've generated images which are representative of various conceptual categories, which the network has learnt about from scraping vast amounts of information from the internet. So, for example, the category West Africa, you can see that there are people who look like the sorts of people you might meet in West Africa. There is text that includes the names of countries in West Africa, and there is architecture that looks like the dwellings that you might find in West Africa. And so the idea here is that the network has learned these high-level abstractions pertaining to really what's quite an abstract concept here, a geographical location. And of course, we know, dating back to 2000, well, even to before, but particularly to a landmark paper in 2004 by Rodrigo Juan Quiroga, that if we look in the medial temporal lobe of the human, then we see similar sorts of representational units, those that respond to concepts, in this case, the concept of a famous actress, in a way which is invariant to the format in which the information is presented. So whether it's with that actress portraying a particular character, or whether it's a line drawing of the actual person, the actual actress in real life, or whether it's just the name of the actress's name in text. And those recordings being made from the medial temporal lobe, prominently from the hippocampus. So there's really, I think, kind of a coherent story about abstraction being really important for forms of high-level complex behavior, intelligent behavior, in particular those that require novel inferences. But as I said, I'm going to try and present a slightly different view today. And the view begins with the idea, which is that really dealing with the world presents or dealing with the natural world presents unique challenges, which might be quite different from some of the settings to which particularly we expose some of our machine learning architectures. And first and foremost amongst those, I think, is the fact that the world is essentially non-stationary. And that means that sensory signals exhibit an intrinsic autocorrelation in time. So that, for example, these are two images of bike rides, which neither of them were done by me, but you can imagine they might have been. And in one setting, it's, you can imagine an individual cycling through a city at one time. And in the second, the individual cycling through along a road by a lake in a rural setting. And the urban and the rural, critically, they are separated in time. So that means that the information, whatever is learnt in context A and context B is quite different, right? And of course, the information that's learnt in context A might not be relevant for context B. There might be unique information which is learnt in context A. And critically, we experience these contexts in time, but also, although they might be autocorrelated in time, there is also, we cycle back to similar contexts, right? So, after having gone on a bike ride out in the countryside, I might come back into the city, and I need to use my knowledge of the highway code in the city and what to do at traffic lights and how to avoid dangerous cars and so on in that city setting once again. And I think this is really emblematic of the challenge that we face as biological organisms. And I think this also places a unique computational challenge on an information processing system, which isn't readily solved by the story which I gave you at the beginning about just forming high-level abstractions. And so in my talk today, what I want to do is try to illustrate some ways in which I think the brain solves this problem. And ultimately, to sort of give you my take-home message, the kind of solutions that we're going to come up with is that the brain is really faced with a sorting problem. And that sorting problem is that information that's arrived that arrives in different contexts needs to be effectively partitioned in ways such that it avoids mutual interference, or what in machine learning and psychology has been called catastrophic interference. But also so that by dint of segregating that information, we can facilitate compositional forms of reuse. So in other words, I can learn stuff about what I need to do in context A, and I can learn other stuff about what I need to do in context B. And perhaps in some new context, I can deploy some combination of that knowledge from A and knowledge from B in a way which allows me to solve context C, even though I've never encountered it before. And that composition, in which I draw specifically upon bits of A and bits of B and meld them together to solve C, is going to be very different from, kind of the big picture, the story of, if I just have enough context A, B, C, D all the way through to Z, then, I can deal with any new context because I've formed big general abstractions over them. Okay, so my talk I want to illustrate with 3 different projects which we're doing in the lab. So actually none of these projects are yet published. The first one is released as a cosine abstract, and a lot of and part of what I'm going to say is also on preprint. The second project is close to completion. We're about to put it on preprint. And the last one is really, really off the press, and it's in a very early stage of development, but I thought it would be fun to share it with you anyway. So the first one really draws upon many of you may be thinking that the way I've introduced this problem has, of course, a precedent, a long precedent in machine learning dating back to the 90s and before. And it's often in machine learning and AI research referred to as the problem of continual learning, which is a term which is increasingly penetrating into neuroscience as well. And so my first illustration of this problem and a particular solution is going to be through the lens of continual learning. I'm going to talk about it in the context of actually a well-worn task, which we have used, and we've used a particular variant of this task involving tree classification. This task is sometimes called the context-dependent decision-making task, and it's been used to great effect by people like Valerio Mante and Matthew Rushworth and many others to investigate decision-making. So in this task, you can imagine a space composed of potentially high-dimensional space, but for the purposes of the ground truth, space is going to be organized according to 2 dimensions. And the stimuli that are in this space are pictures of trees, and the dimensions are going to be the leaf density and branch density of those trees. So you can imagine the trees existing in the space as I've drawn here. And on the x-axis, we have the branch density, and on the y-axis, we have the leaf density. And what participants are going to do, they're going to view these trees in 2 different contexts. And in one of the contexts, they're going to be obliged to make a binary classification according to the leaf density. And on the other context, they're going to make a classification according to the branch density. And in all of the tasks I'm going to talk about initially, at least, those 2 contexts are going to be signaled explicitly to the participant, but they're going to occur in a kind of random interleaved fashion. So the actual task that participants see looks a bit like this. They see this, first of all, this context, which is actually the form of garden, which can either be in the summer or the winter. I think we call it the North Garden and the South Garden. And then they see a tree, and they have to make a decision about whether to plant that tree or not. And the rule can be something like you have to plant the trees which are leafy, or you have to plant the trees which are less branchy, more branchy, and so on and so on. And then participants get a reward, a feedback, a trial-wise reward signal, at least during training, which tells them what to do, which allows them to learn the rules of the task. And critically, in all the experiments I'm going to talk about, we don't tell people that leafiness and branchiness are the key dimensions. We just show them some trees and ask them to figure it out. So the problem that they have to solve is to take a potentially high dimensional space really open-ended problem, and they have to learn the appropriate feature dimensions, the appropriate rules to solve the task. Okay, so in the first experiment, which I'm going to talk about, which is actually a scanning experiment, and I will show you some brain imaging data just very briefly. Participants do a brief baseline task. They then go through a relatively long, prolonged training phase, and then we scan them at the end on this task. And so the data shown on this slide show you the improvement from baseline to scan session, so pre to post learning effectively. And what you can see is that their accuracy on this task grows from baseline to scan. They're not at chance on baseline because they get a little bit of, they actually get a little bit of pre-training beforehand. I should have mentioned this. And they're not getting any feedback during baseline or scanning sessions. This is, they get all their feedback during the training. But what we can do is we can try and decompose the errors that people make on this task to try to understand what they have learned. So the psychophysicists among you might think, well, you know, kind of it would be obvious to conceive of this task, conceive of learning during this task as perhaps a debiasing process, or perhaps a growing sensitivity, like a perceptual sensitivity. So for example, the offset or slope of the psychometric function might converge to, you know, more propitious values, right? So the offset might reduce to 0 and the slope might get steeper and steeper over time. And that's actually not what we see at all. So we don't see any differences between those psychometric variables during performance of the task. What we see instead is that essentially participants learn effectively where the category boundary is in this potentially high dimensional tree space. So what I mean by that is if you plot out their probability, here I've plotted out for the probability, this is in the plot on the right, which is yellow and black, you can see that the yellow the yellow colors mean a high probability of responding plant, and the black colors mean a low probability. And what you can see is that this participant has learned broadly to respond plant when the leafiness was low and not when the leafiness was high. And in this particular example, the ground truth is that, you know, they have to respond according to leafiness. And you can see that the green arrow signals the angle of the best fitting boundary in this two-dimensional space. And you can imagine that someone who hasn't learned the rules, that, you know, that arrow could be pointing in any direction, essentially. But what it's doing is it's pointing approximately horizontally. If it was perfectly horizontal, the arrow would be 0. And what you can see is that from baseline to scan, the error decreases dramatically, on average 20 or 30%. And so what that means is that participants over the course of training are learning the appropriate rules of the task. And so, okay, so what I'm going to do is, rather than tell you about the imaging data, I'll do that in a second, but what I want to do is I want to think about how people might solve this problem computationally. And to do that, our tool of choice is going to be a neural network, but it's going to be a very, very simple neural network. We're not dealing with, you know, big fancy convolutional or deep reinforcement learning networks here, like you might in AI research. We're dealing with it's a multi-layer perceptron. It's just a feed-forward neural network with a single hidden layer. And we're going to simulate performance on this task using not the actual tree space, although we have done this with the tree space. And if you do add convolutions, you can get the same data. But for simplicity, what we're going to do is we're going to use these Gaussian blob stimuli. So now you can think of these by analogy with the trees. They're little mini images of a gray blob on a white background, and the X and Y coordinates of the blob, you can think of them as being equivalent to leafiness and branchiness in tree space. So they're just like stylized images, if you like. And so what we're going to do is we're going to feed these in to the neural network. And the network is also going to receive an input into one of 2 units, which tells it what the context is, right? So is the context to respond, like, are they in the north garden or the south garden? Is it to respond according to the X dimension or according to the Y dimension? And we're just going to train the network end-to-end to solve this problem, which of course it can do. It's perfectly trivially easy to do. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the neural geometry which emerges in the hidden layer after we've trained the neural network. So in order to do this, what we do is we take the images one by one after training, after convergence. We take the stylized images one by one, then we feed them through the network. We take the vector of activations in the hidden layer, and we use that to generate a representational dissimilarity matrix. So that's a matrix which tells me how similar each of those vectors is to every other vector. And I'm then going to use that. I'm just going to reduce the dimensionality of that matrix in order to make it easy to visualize using multidimensional scaling. And then I'm going to plot out the distance between each image and each other image in a two-dimensional plane. And that's what's shown on this plot here. So if you look on the left, it's the results from the neural network. And what you can see is that the information from the two contexts forms a cross. So in other words, it's projected onto two broadly orthogonal planes. And one way of thinking about what's happening here is that effectively the information is remaining in the native space, which is defined by the X and Y position, right? So the two principal axes, which we have, as the experimenters have introduced, as axes of variation. But in each case, the information is being compressed along the irrelevant dimension. And so that means that, when you're in task B, when you're doing task B, the information is compressed along the dimension pertaining to task A. And when you're in task, the other way around, whatever I said the other one was. And so we get these characteristic orthogonal planes representation. And when we look in bold signal, this is recording during the scan phase of the task. So we're going to do exactly the same thing. During the scan phase, participants are seeing the trees one by one. They're deciding whether to plant them or not. And so we can take each of the trees, these are real trees now, each of the trees, and we can look at the bold signal in a searchlight or in a region of interest. These are regions focused on the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal cortex. And what we can do is we can do exactly the same trick, right? So now instead of hidden layer activation, hidden unit activations, we have levels of bold signal in multivoxel patterns. And we can do that for each tree to every other tree as a function of its position in tree space. And when we do that, we generate an RDM. And when we project that RDM down into two dimensions, this is cleaned up a little bit, but we get exactly the same cross, essentially. Both. So what we have here is we have a very nice...
Sorry, Chris, is it possible that people ask questions between your talk, or you prefer that the questions you ask at the end?
I'm happy to take questions. Maybe better to take clarification questions because I have quite a bit to get through, but yeah, sure.
Nishi has a question.
So I was just wondering whether the amount of compression depends on the informational capacity of the hidden layer of the neural network that you are using.
Oh, great question. Actually, I mean, yeah, so it does to some extent. Yeah, so actually in the paper, I mean, you can read our paper in which, so I've skipped over all of there's a tremendous focus on trying in the paper in trying to understand the different computational determinants of the sorts of representations that you get in the hidden layer. What we actually focus on, rather than the width of the hidden layer, what we focus on is actually the initial weight scale. And what you can see is that by changing the initial weight scale, you can push the network into either a low dimensional regime, which is the one I'm focusing on here. That's if the initial weight scale is low. If the initial weight scale is higher, so you can think of that as being sort of broadly like a more densely connected network, right, with stronger synaptic efficacy. You go into a completely different regime, which is one that has been emphasized in earlier work by people like Stefano Fusi, which is that the information is really, really high dimensional, and there's really actually very little learning that goes on between the initial layer and the hidden layer, and everything is basically just readout from this high dimensional space. And you can toggle between those two, and you can actually show that changing the initial weight scale really toggles between those two. Of course, that finding builds upon work which is already described in machine learning. So that's not a wholly novel finding in our hands. So yeah, maybe best to, rather than my unpacking that in detail, maybe best to look at Timo's preprint, which has been up for about a month now. But thanks for the question. So really the point I want to make on this slide is that humans look a lot like this neural geometry, the representational geometry in the human prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex. It's a lot like what you see in the neural network. And just briefly, of course, we can, as I said, we're measuring this effectively this angle of the estimated boundary in tree space from each unique individual in each garden. Ideally, they should be perfectly orthogonal to each other. And so we can use those values to generate an index which sort of says how factorized their representation of tree space is behaviorally. And we can correlate that with the degree of factorization that we get in the neural data in both of these regions. And you can see there's a really quite striking correlation in both of the two regions I've emphasized. So in other words, those participants who partition tree space more effectively are those who see these more factorized representations in cortex. So if we look, we had access to, thanks to the generous actions of Valerio Mante, who's recorded a conceptually similar data set in the non-human primate. It's a data set in which the monkeys are discriminating dots which move in different directions and are different colors. And that data set is generously made freely available. So we were able to actually work with Valerio to analyze this data. And you can see that you get very similar patterns of data. There's some discrepancies between the precise report, earlier report of these data. I'm happy to go into those in some detail. We think we understand where those come from. But broadly, when you examine the data in the same way as we did, you get the same sort of cross or orthogonal representations, although they're not quite so neatly overlaid. So we see something that is common to these biological and artificial neural networks. But what I really want to do is to focus on why this happens. And I think this is the point that is going to link back to the question of knowledge partitioning that I introduced earlier. So empirically, what we observe over the course of training is that those two context units, so that is the units that say whether you're in the North Garden or the South Garden, although the weights linking those units to the hidden layer begin, of course, completely randomly, over the course of training, as the network converges, what happens is the weights associated with those two units become anti-correlated with one another. So that means that the weight going from context unit 1 to a given hidden unit becomes anti-correlated, or if it has positive sign, the one going from the other unit will have negative sign going to that hidden unit. So why does that happen? So we can see why that happens by thinking just a little bit about the dynamics of training in the multi-layer perceptron, equipped as it is with rectified linear units, or ReLUs, which are the nonlinearity in the hidden layer, which are necessary to solve this task. So if you can think of the inputs, the naive space of inputs. Of course, we have high dimensional inputs, but of course, if you project these down into a low dimensional space, I mean, that will just basically conserve the dissimilarities amongst them. And so at the input level, the neural geometry of tree space looks a lot like essentially how we, the researchers, conceived of it, right? Which is that it's in 2 dimensions and everything's organized on this kind of well-ordered grid. And that's what's shown on the leftmost of the 3 plots here. Just for reference, here the size and color, or size and greenness of the dots signal, you can think of them as signaling like leafiness and branchiness. Okay, so we begin with a grid, but of course, remember that over the course of training, what happens is that these context units become anti-correlated with one another. And so effectively what that ends up doing is it ends up pushing alternate parts of this pushing these inputs alternately according to context into alternate parts of the hidden unit activations. And so basically where there is a positive weight from the context unit, it'll essentially the hidden unit will have an opposing sign to where there is a negative weight from the other hidden unit. So effectively, what's happening is that the anti-correlated weights from the 2 context units are effectively what they're doing is they're organizing the information into completely orthogonal subspaces. And because we're using ReLUs, what that means is because the effect of the rectified linear unit is essentially just to set everything that's below 0 to 0 itself, right? What that means is that you now have 2 positive activation spaces. This is what's shown on the right, but they are of course perfectly orthogonal to one another. So the effect of the anti-correlated units is to orthogonalize the subspaces and thus to prevent mutual interference between the processing in one garden and the processing in the other garden. And what we can do, interestingly, is we can take, armed with this intuition, we can segregate the hidden units in the network into those that, basically those that code for task A or code for task B. And in fact, what we can see is that what emerges is a set of units that code for task, and also then there are some other units that code principally for the stimulus itself. And we can separate out those units, those task selective and stimulus selective units, and we can plot maps of their response to information along the relevant and the irrelevant dimension. So if you look at the task selective units, which are shown on the bottom plots here, so I'm focusing, if you focus for the moment on the middle, the bluey greeny plots which are on the left. So you can see that on the bottom of those two plots, there is essentially in one, the main axis goes vertically, and in the other, the main axis goes horizontally. And what that tells us is that you've got some task selected units that are coding for essentially the relevant dimension in one context, and the other that are coding for the relevant dimension in the other context. And those two are orthogonal, forming the orthogonal planes that we saw in the neural geometry. And then we have some other, the stimulus units, which actually code for, interestingly, for effectively something which is rotated with 45 degrees with respect to this. But because we have units from the FEF in the monkey, which were recorded on what is, it's not done with trees, but it's an equivalent task with color and motion, we can look at the response properties of those units too, and we can separate them out again by now whether they care about the color task or the motion task, and we can see that we get exactly the same factorization. So some task units that code for essentially the boundary in one dimension, some that code for the boundary in another dimension, and approximately we get stimulus selective units that code for the diagonals as well. And so there's been a lot of interest recently about, kind of the extent to which you see mixed selectivity in neural populations. And what we see here, I think, is, really, it's kind of like, it's almost like a compromised position, right? We do see mixed selectivity, but it's not like this sort of, completely random, high dimensional, uninterpretable mixed selectivity, which people often attribute both to the macaque prefrontal cortex and to neural networks themselves. In fact, at least in this, what we call the rich regime, which is this regime where you have this highly structured, low dimensional representations. In this regime, mixed selectivity is not random. It's really nicely partitioned according to context and stimulus in a way which is like really, really optimized for performing this task. And in particular, it's optimized for minimizing mutual interference between the two contexts which the agent is performing. So of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is an old problem, right? The problem of continual learning, the idea that, after learning task A and task B, you have the opportunity for interference between the two tasks. So if you don't have some mechanism of protecting learning about task A when you're performing task B, then in a return to task A, what's going to happen is that essentially your knowledge of how to perform that task will have been overwritten. And famously, we know that without kind of additional computational steps, neural networks tend to be vulnerable to these forms of catastrophic forgetting. Whereas humans, although they of course suffer various forms of proactive and retroactive interference, here retroactive being the key one, they broadly are resistant, or at least partly resistant to this problem. And so in an earlier experiment using the same stimuli, we actually we investigated different theories for why humans might be more resistant to this, more resistant to interference than neural networks, and we did it in the following way. So we're again using the tree task, and once again at test we have these interleaved conditions in which we're interleaving north garden and south garden, one after the other, so participants are constantly switching back from one context to another. And again at test here we're giving no feedback. But what we do is we're comparing test performance under 2 training conditions. And in one training condition, well, actually we used 4, but I'm just going to focus on the 2 most extreme here, right? So in the most extreme training condition, we trained participants on all consistent stimuli from one context, all in a row. So like North Garden for like several hundred trials. And then we switched them only into South Garden. So they basically only learned to do one switch trial. They only got one switch trial in the entire experiment, if you like. And then in the more extreme condition, we switched them like really randomly. We switched them randomly. So they were switching really, really regularly from one context to another. And our question was, which of these 2 helps performance in this later interleaved test? And what we see is actually, so the results are shown here on the plots on the bottom. So the training data are on the left, but if you focus your attention for a moment on the bar plot that's in the middle. So if you compare performance on the inter, which is the lightest gray, and the B200, what we call blocked 200, which is our most blocked condition, you can see that there's a really, there's a quite substantial benefit to being trained in a blocked fashion. And once again, using various model fitting techniques, we can show that that blocked benefit is due not to either kind of the slope or the intercept getting better, it's due to this rule learning process unfolding over time. And for those of you who are familiar with like the literature on this problem, perhaps in the 1990s and maybe even more recently, this is quite a surprising finding because it's a canonical, I think, view, at least in some of the memory community, that actually the way that people solve this problem is precisely by virtually interleaving information which may have been learnt in an autocorrelated fashion in such a way that essentially breaks that autocorrelation pattern and reduces the scope for catastrophic interference. So this is, of course, a theory known as complementary learning systems theory, and we owe it to people like Ken Norman and Jay McClelland. And I think that what our data show is that actually interleaving per se is not all that good, right? So interleaving per se is at least not the whole story. And there is actually an intrinsic benefit to learning information in an autocorrelated fashion that goes, so that autocorrelation, rather than being sort of pernicious for solving continual learning, is actually beneficial. And this is a theme which I'm going to elaborate on more as we talk about this idea of knowledge partitioning. Okay, and so what we can do, I think, is we can capitalize on the intuitions that I told you about earlier to try and understand how we can actually build a model by which you can circumvent this catastrophic interference problem. And it's going to look like this, right? So broadly, what we're going to remember the intuition that if we have anti-correlated weights from context unit for North Garden and context unit for South Garden, then we essentially partition the information into orthogonal subspaces, and that allows us to circumvent the problem of mutual interference, of catastrophic interference. So if we clamp, now we're going to go in and we're just going to use, sort of surgical, like cheating clamping device. We're going to clamp those weights to be anti-correlated. Then you can see that after training, this is shown on the bar plot on the right, after training on both the blocked and the interleaved curriculum, then the network does absolutely perfectly on the later interleaved test. Whereas, if we take a standard neural network, in the blocked condition, it learns first one context, then it learns the next context, and by the time you go back to the first context, it's completely forgotten. So that's why the blue bar is at chance on test. So clamping these weights to be anti-correlated circumvents this problem, as you would expect. But of course, what we want to do is we want to learn that rather than just clamping it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make 2 assumptions, and I think they're reasonable assumptions, widespread assumptions in the literature. And the first is that essentially neural information processing is sluggish in some way. And so what this means is that there are carryover effects from the trial history. So of course, extraordinarily well-established finding in the literature. We know that there are manifold choice history effects whereby my decision on trial T is going to be at least partly influenced by what happened on trial T-1, irrespective of whether my trials are sampled IID or not. Right? And the second assumption we're going to make is that there's some sort of Hebbian learning. And that Hebbian learning is essentially going to have the effect of clustering together information which happens close together in time, and by extension, it's going to essentially orthogonalize things which happen further apart in time. Right? So the suggestion that I'm making here is that just by learning that things that are closer together in time should sort of cluster together, and that there are carryover effects, this is going to be enough to solve this problem of mutual interference. And so the model that embodies that looks like this. So essentially what we have is the information arriving in an autocorrelated fashion in time. And over the course of that information, there's then going to be updates from context unit 1 to the hidden unit. Because of the Hebbian learning, those are all going to become associated. We're now going to get information from context 2, and those are all going to become associated as well. Now, you can imagine in the interleaved case, that doesn't happen, right? Because, you know, the Hebbian learning is going to associate things in time. And if you've got everything from context 1 and context 2 mixed up in time, they're all going to get associated together. You're not going to form these nice clusters corresponding to distinct contexts. We call this the sluggish SLA model. We probably need a better name. But what you can see is that when you train this network on exactly the problem that the trees task, the blocked and interleaved trees task that I've just been talking about, you can see that this sluggish SLA is sufficient to solve the problem. So if we take a vanilla artificial neural network, in the interleaved condition, of course, it learns the correct boundary in task A and task B. So you can see that the boundaries it learns on the bottom plots are orthogonal. But of course, in the blocked condition, it just overwrites context B with context A. So task A doesn't look like it should. It looks like task B, right? Because there's been catastrophic interference. The sluggish SLA model in the blocked condition, because of this Hebbian learning, learns to nicely partition the information, makes the context weights orthogonal to one another, and you know, that is sufficient to allow the continual learning problem to be solved. In the interleaved condition, interestingly, what happens is, because you've got everything mixed together, because of the sluggishness, what happens is that actually the interference from one trial to another actually prevents the network from effectively partitioning the information appropriately. And so you get a mild decrement in performance, which is basically exactly what we see in the humans. And that decrement expresses itself through a failure to appropriately learn the rule boundary. And so when we look at performance, standard ANN, as we've seen, does badly because of catastrophic interference. If we clamp the weights, we do really, really well. But in the sluggish SLA network, we're able to recreate both humans' ability to solve the problem and the fact that they benefit from blocked over interleaved training. So as I said, this is described in a cosine abstract, and David Nagy, who's in Gregor Orban's group, and Timo Flesch are the lead authors on this. Okay, so Sarah, you will tell me how long I have left, because I feel like I'm doing badly on time.
No, sorry. You started at 3, and because I have time difference between and I'm calculating time. And yeah, you started at
so it's now 3:45. So I guess
so you have 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes. Okay, I think I can do the rest in 15 minutes. Good. So yeah, 15, okay. 15 I know this. It looks like I'm only 1/3 of the way through, but I'm really not. Okay, so the next part is about something that we call knowledge assembly, right? So so in the first part of my talk, I introduced the problem of, like, you learn about one context, and then because the world is autocorrelated, you have to learn about another context, and there's potentially interference between the two. But there's another problem that arises because of the autocorrelation in the world, and it's going to look something like this. So imagine that you learn first about you're a child, and you learn first about coniferous trees, and then subsequently, you know, kind of maybe in the next year in school or whatever, you learn about deciduous trees. And then after that, I give you a new piece of information about coniferous trees, such as, for example, they're evergreen, right? So that means that they don't lose their leaves in winter, right? And you learn that about one evergreen, one coniferous tree. So one of the problems that you have here is you want to be able to retrospectively apply that knowledge to all the other things that you learned, or to your knowledge of coniferous trees, which you learned about in this context, which has now passed, right? So you want to be able to update not just this knowledge of this one sort of Christmas tree. It's not just this one Christmas tree that loses its needles over the winter. Sorry, that keeps its needles over the winter. You want to be then able to apply it back to all the other coniferous trees. And so this is a problem which is, of course, ubiquitous. It's a problem which occurs a lot in value learning. It's the basic problem of sensory preconditioning, retrospective reevaluation, and there's echoes of this problem in language. And I think broadly, it's a really interesting computational problem. And of course, at the moment, there's a great deal of interest in replay as a potential mechanism by which this might be solved. But once again, I'm going to argue that there's an alternative to replaying and rehearsing information for solving this problem. Okay, so the task that we use to investigate this looks a bit like this, right? So imagine you've got a whole bunch of novel objects. These are objects that you've never seen before. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you that there is some ordering to these objects along an abstract dimension. So in our experiments, this is called brispiness. So we teach people how brispy these objects are. Of course, these are nonsense objects. Brispiness is a nonsense adjective. And we're going to use, we're just going to teach them. So essentially, this is a transitive inference task. You're learning to rank these objects. And in the experiment that I'm going to describe to you, we're actually going to do this in two independent sets. So once again, we have context A and context B, and they're trained in a blocked fashion. You're going to learn about the brispiness of what I'll call objects 1 to 6, and then the brispiness of objects 7 to 12. And so the way that we, in the experimental setup, what we actually do is, so we train people and we do, this is proper transitive inference, so we train them only on adjacent pairs. And so they learn, for example, that item 4 is more brispy than item 3, and item 6 is more brispy than item 5, but they never see 2 and 6 together. They also never see items from across context together during training. But then we give them a test. And in that test, initially, we just ask them to compare the brispiness of items both within and between contexts. And we're going to plot out a map of how likely they were to respond brispy to each item as a function, to each item and every other item in comparison. So once again, we're going to train a multi-layer perceptron against same network, basically, one hidden layer, and this network solves this task perfectly, of course. And so here's the output of the network, right? So the network here is outputting the probability that each item is more brispy than every other item. And because I've taught it that these items live on 2 lines, it's able to generalize from one line to another, right? So it's able to or both within and between lines. So after training that 4 is more brispy than 3 and 3 is more brispy than 2, it can infer that 5 is more brispy than 1, and so on and so on. It can also infer that the 6th rank item from context 1 is more brispy than the 4th ranked item from context 2, for example, right? And that's just because of the geometry of the neural representations, which it's learnt in its hidden layer, which project onto two lines, which are perfectly parallel with each other. And in fact, in this context, they're also overlapping with each other. I'll skip over this a little bit quickly because this is not exactly the main point of my talk, but this is consistent with a bunch of other stuff which we've published. We had a recent paper, my postdoc Hannah Sheehan in Neuron, which talked about this earlier this year. And there's also earlier work from my PhD student Fabrice Lux in 2019, showing that these parallel lines emerge and that people can use them for generalization. But sorry, this is in the neural network. This is also what people do. So people can also generalize really, really well between and within contexts. All I'm showing you here is an example of a task. So this is, people are learning about brispiness, and then they're seeing these individual items and they're judging. It's actually like a 1-back brispiness judgment. And you can see that people's behavior really, really nicely mirrors the neural network. Interestingly, if we look in, again, those dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and posterior parietal cortex regions, what we see is that the information is projected onto this low-dimensional manifold in 2 parallel lines. So here, the numbers correspond to the brispiness ranks in the 2 contexts. So if you look, for example, in the yellow box, you can see that the line sort of follows round from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 in a nice, well-ordered low-dimensional projection. It's not perfectly straight. There are reasons for that, which I don't have time to go into. We see a nice correspondence between the geometry and the hidden layer of the multi-layer perceptron and the bold signal in this case, posterior parietal cortex. But what I want to focus on is something else. So what we then do is, I need the next slide. So what we then do is we then do what we call boundary training. And this is actually an old technique. It's actually used quite extensively in studies in macaque studies in the 80s and 90s, where it was called list linking. Some of you may know this literature, really cool literature. But broadly, what you do is you take the most Brispy item from context 1 and the least Brispy item from context 2, and you say that least Brispy item from context 2 is more Brispy than the Brispy item from context 1. So I think I actually have where's my video? I had a video of it. Never mind. Okay. So broadly, in this boundary training, what you're doing, so what I'm doing is I'm teaching people that these items really, rather than lying on 2 parallel lines from 1 to 6, they lie on a single line from 1 to 12. So the item that I'm labeling 7 is actually more Brispy than the item that I'm labeling 6, even though they previously thought that the opposite was true. And they just get literally 20 trials of this. We just teach them this in 20 trials. So really, really short training session. And then we give them a test, which is in all ways identical to the test which I just described. And if you look at performance in that, on average, people are really, really good. And so I've actually divided out. So the short axis, this is the previous data that I'm just re-showing for comparison on the left. And here I've actually divided people up into 2 groups. Although, you know, if you look at the ensemble, what you can see is that obviously it's like a sort of average of these 2. So broadly, people are really good on the basis of this very, very short training of almost automatically inferring that now, rather than having 2 parallel lines, everything lies on a single big long line. There are some people who don't get it quite so well. We call those the poorer performers. Just for illustration, I've separated them out here, but broadly, people are really, really, really good at this. And interestingly, when you look in the brain, what you can see is that in those same regions, the neural representations shift, despite the fact there's only 20 trials and they've had no rest period, there's no time for rehearsal or replay, or very, very little time for rehearsal or replay. What happens is that you get a very, very rapid reconfiguration of the neural geometry in these brain regions, so that now everything in the brain, not just in behavior, but in the brain, lies on a big long line as well. So this is kind of an interesting finding, but what I want to really illustrate for you is a theory which I think builds upon the previous work, which explains why this might happen. And the theory looks like this, and I should really emphasize that I'm really just a sort of messenger here. So this is work that the intellectual inspiration for this work comes from Andrew Sachs and Lucas Braun, who's our joint PhD student, really amazing PhD student who came up with these ideas almost completely on his own. So the idea is as follows, right? So you take a network to solve this problem, which here I've just expressed it as a Siamese network. So this is just for convenience. Right now you have actually one set of inputs for each of the 2 items which you're comparing, and you have tied weights between them, but that's a detail. But what happens in Lucas's network is as follows, right? Is that during training, you use the network is essentially trying to learn an embedding for items in a hidden layer, which here the hidden layer is really it's actually just composed of, in the simplest case, can be composed of 2 units. Of course, you could make it much higher dimensional if you wanted. In the simplest case, you can just imagine it literally as an X and a Y position. And what the network is trained to do is to find an embedding for each of the items, which is going to minimize the loss on the problem of judging which of these is more and which of these is less in Brispiness space. So essentially what it's doing, you're training it to find that embedding where they lie on a line effectively. And when you do that for the short axis training, you get exactly the same. In fact, this network is formally equivalent to the one that I just showed you. It learns that the 2 items lie on a line. But critically, during that training period, the network is also learning something else that we call adjacency. And the adjacency is really, adjacency is a bit of a terrible name. We need to come up with a better name, but really it's a kind of confidence in how sure you are about the embedding of that particular item. So you can imagine any 2 items like 3 and 4. So you can imagine a case where you're really certain about where they lie in embedding space, right? And that's shown on the left. That's what we call high adjacency. On the right, you might be much less certain about where they lie. And that adjacency matrix is then going to give you information about the extent to which any new information that you learn about 4 should also be applied to 3. Sorry, there should be another arrow going from 4 pointing in the same direction as 3. Right? So you can imagine that if I learn about 4, if 4 and 3 have high adjacency, it's like I'm sure about their embeddings, right? So what that means is that I should apply new learning new information that I've learned about 4, I should apply it to 3 as well. It's just like my coniferous tree example, right? I know, I'm really, really sure that pine trees are also coniferous trees. So when I learn that Christmas trees, or when I learn that Douglas firs lose their leaves, don't lose their leaves in winter, I'm really sure that I can apply that knowledge to pine trees as well, but not in the case where I'm less sure about their embeddings. And so this is what Lucas's network does. And what we can see is that by simply controlling the extent to which, basically this adjacency, there's just a scaling parameter on the extent to which this adjacency mediates the extent to which new learning modulates old representations. And if this parameter is high, then we can perfectly recreate the behavior of the good performers. These are the ones who automatically learn that, the lists lie on a single, basically the representations lie on a single line rather than on 2 parallel lines. And if we just scale down this parameter, we can learn the sort of partial overlap, which is representative of what we call the poor performers do, where they sort of learn that the lines are like a little bit pushed apart, but they don't learn that they lie wholly on a single line. So I think this is another principle, right, whereby partitioning information into contexts allows you to then, kind of learn what goes with what, and then new learning can then spread from any one item in a particular context to other items in that context. And you can think of this as a mechanism also for solving other sorts of things like sensory preconditioning and so on. Okay, maybe I'll just give you, I know I'm really at time, so I'll just give you a real broad overview of the last work, also because it's very underdeveloped, as I said. So I began by talking about generalization and abstraction. And, very often people start their articles these days by saying, well, humans are really, really good at generalization. And, kind of like we want to build our neural networks like that because humans are amazing at forming high-level abstractions, basically like, my Lego Star Wars example. But when I think of that claim, I imagine myself, once upon a time, just having got off a plane in Seoul and trying to buy a ticket on the Seoul metro system, and being faced with a situation like this, and where was my high-level abstraction to deal with novelty when I needed it? Well, it definitely wasn't. It wasn't present and correct. And I think this is a ubiquitous issue, which is that in actual fact, faced with novelty, very often we flounder. And in fact, we're not all that good at just generalizing to wholly novel situations that do not share surface similarity with our existing experiences. And this is, a claim. Obviously, this has been a very controversial issue. We could discuss this, the questions if you're interested. But these are quotes from a sort of a well cited survey of transfer learning in humans, which was published some 20 years ago. And it talks about many different reviews of the literature on human transfer learning, which suggests that actually transfer is really, really fragile. Right? So humans are not very good at generalizing out of the box. And so in the work that we're doing right now, what we're trying to do is really get a systematic handle on like how good are people at transfer or not. And the answers that we're going to come up with are going to be consistent, I think, with what I've just told you. So the task looks like this. So you see on each trial, you see a colored animal, and there are 5 possible animals and 5 possible colors. And during training, what we're going to do is we're going to give you essentially slices through a 2-dimensional space given by color and animal. So I'm going to show you only donkeys of different colors or only red things of different animals. And so you're never going to see, for example, a blue rat or a yellow chicken, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to train you on these slices, and then I'm going to test you on the held out examples. And my question is, how well do you do? And so this is the full space. And so once again, if we look at a neural network trying to solve this problem, of course, a problem like this is trivial for a network to, a neural network to solve with no further bells and whistles, right? It'll just, it's a linear problem, essentially. It'll just learn it straight out of the box. But what we're going to assume is that, like in the studies that I just talked about, there's essentially context A and context B. And we're going to assume that people learn essentially about the information in one context, so say the color context, and then they're going to try and partition that information and learn separately about information in a new context if and only if there's a sort of surprising change in the stimulation sequence. So if you get a switch from like, so something went wrong with my animation. If you get a switch from the red rabbit to the gray donkey, where information sort of changes radically, then suddenly you're going to learn about this. You're going to learn about donkeys in a different you're going to learn about color in a different subspace to how you learn about animals. So you're essentially going to learn two factorized functions rather than just a single global solution. And that makes a nice prediction, which is that for some people, generalization fails because what they will do is they will only use one of the factors to solve novel inference problems, right? So rather than being able to marshal all the different bits of the world that we've learnt about in order to solve a novel problem, we'll just use a subset of that information. And the prediction then is that what you will see at test is a kind of collapse onto one of the training dimensions, right? So in other words, kind of people will think that the stimulus that lies here, all the green stimuli lie here and all the yellow stimuli lie here, for example. But in the animal dimension, they'll do just fine, or vice versa. And broadly, so essentially they're learning about animals and colors in two different bins. And so broadly, maybe I'll just show you some examples. So broadly, that's exactly what we see in people's data, right? So here's an example of, these are two participants who learn the task really, really well. So you can see, we call this bilateral behavior. So you can see that they broadly learn to place the test examples exactly where they should be. And here's an example of participants, and we have many of these participants who do exactly this. They do this kind of collapse onto one of the dimensions. And we think this is a hallmark of this learning about the world essentially by its parts. Of course, we get some rubbish participants as well. And if you do model fitting, we have lots of model fitting, but broadly what you see is that the model that works best is a model in which people first learn unilaterally about the data and then bilaterally about the data. So they first learn about one dimension and then about another dimension. And we think this is like a general feature of how people learn. They don't learn in parallel, they learn by clumps, and those clumps are defined by context. And we have various curriculum manipulations which are designed to accentuate learning in a clumpy way or a less clumpy way. And broadly, I don't have time to tell you about them all, but broadly, the curriculum manipulations push people to learn. If you train them in a kind of clumpy curriculum, they display more of this sort of these signatures of compositional behavior. Okay, lots of data. So I started out here. So I said that life is a little bit like this. And I think that rather than learning high-level abstractions, really what we do is we do something a bit like this, right? So what we do is we assemble bits of information on the fly into kind of useful, you might think of them as kind of cognitive tools, or maybe even heuristics, if you like. We assemble them on the fly into little pieces of knowledge, which we keep well partitioned from one another. And when we deal with novelty, the way in which we deal with novelty is by drawing from this toolkit and doing relatively rapid and probably approximate assembly of this knowledge to try to solve novel problems in an approximate fashion, rather than relying on really, really high level abstract concepts. Okay, I went over time. I'm really sorry, but I'm really grateful for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed for your fantastic talk. And yeah, is there any question?
Maybe I would like to ask another question. So what do you think about how generalization depends on the level of abstraction of the task itself? So my intuition would be that low-level tasks, low-level skills generalize better. So for example, a tennis player would be a better baseball player than a wrestler, for example. But in high-level tasks, when you consciously do stuff, you see like outright compartmentalization sometimes. So yeah, like the opposite of generalization.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, you've articulated beautifully my thinking on this matter, right? So broadly, and I think it's to do with the nature of the world as well, right? So if you think about it, sensory signals are like nice and smooth for the most part, right? They usually, I mean, of course, the world is smooth with exceptions, right? But broadly, things are pretty smooth and well behaved. In the motor domain, like you mentioned tennis, right? Kind of there is also there's a smoothness to the motor actions that you use when and playing tennis and playing baseball, right? So what that means is because the world is relatively smooth, you can use function approximation to do to do generalization in those domains, I think. And that's why we generalize reasonably well in sensory and motor problems. But when it comes to cognition, I think, I think that I could not emphasize that this is really, if you thinking about what our research agenda should be in computational neuroscience at the moment, I think, it's really shocking that we are still so focused on worrying about sensory motor problems and we ignore the computational challenges of cognition to such a great extent. And I think that when we do try and tackle those computational problems, we do, and the work I described is guilty of this too, right? But we take the only tools that we have for dealing with this at the moment are like we use RL models and we use neural networks, which are both broadly based on gradient descent, right? But I think that cognitive problems they're just poorly suited to dealing with, to being solved with something that looks like gradient descent, because the sorts of mapping problems that cognition entails, they're just not differentiable. And I think there's a really, really fundamental issue, like the ways in which, we need to generalize from, I don't know, my knowledge of how to negotiate London to my knowledge of how to negotiate Tokyo. The forms of generalization that we need to do not lend themselves to being solved with, just really, 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 big, powerful function approximation problems. And I think we need a new computational language for thinking about how to solve those problems that focuses more on things like rule discovery, right? How do we learn, we need to learn how to solve deterministic problems, because many of these problems are deterministic, right? And we need to think about rules and hypothesis testing, and we need mature computational theories of these things.
And do you think these two systems coexist in humans, like, or are the low-level differentiable systems are being forced to solve the high-level categorization problems as well, and then doing poorly?
Not in humans. No, I think that in humans we have a completely unique set of ways of solving cognitive problems, which we don't really have a good computational language for in machine learning. And my feeling is that one of the reasons why, if you look at the critiques which are leveled at current AI systems, I think a lot of them boil down to the fact that we're trying to use the tools, the sorts of function approximation tools which work really, really well in sensory motor domains. We're trying to use those same tools to solve cognitive tasks. And those they're just not robust in the face of cognitive problems. They work great for, kind of like, image classification or video classification, even for various forms of like language generation and so on. And of course, for relatively, if you look at deep RL systems, they're pretty good at like, running around like labyrinth-like environments and, kind of chasing balls and shooting blasters and like doing all that kind of stuff. But as soon as you try to get them to do anything really complex, like you try to get them to actually navigate, right? They're basically rubbish. And that is the state of the art today. And I think it's because we don't have the right computational tools for thinking about cognition.
Thank you. Any other question? If not, we would have one-to-one meetings in same room, and we would start with Mishi.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming along.
See you again.
So we just stay here.